And we're back. This is Colombia Calling. I'm Richard McColl, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. We have a very special guest on the show this week. He's in London. We're doing it early because we're both parents and we have things to do. We have people to look after. His name is David Arrowsmith. He's an author, much published author. He's got a new book out, released in June, called Narcoball, Love, Death, and Football in Escobar's Colombia. David, welcome on the Colombia Calling podcast.
Hi, Richard. Pleasure to be here. Lovely to be talking to all your listeners. And hopefully we can have a nice conversation about my new book.
Well, of course, we're here to promote it, but of course we're going to get into the topics in a bit more profundity and just talk about this. But let's say, first and foremost, David, writing a book about Colombia, writing a book about Escobar and football, what is your connection to Colombia? You must have one.
Yeah, that's a very valid question. Thank you for asking it. So this is my first non-fiction book, and perhaps, as it might often be the case, I guess, with a non-fiction project that gets born the way this one did, it does come from a very personal place. It's a very personal story to me. I'm half Colombian. I was born and raised in London, but my mother is Colombian. She was born in Medellin and raised in Bogota, and she only came to the UK in the late 60s with my young half brother and half sister, who are both born in Colombia and fully Colombian by birth. And so I was raised in a sort of Anglo-Colombian household in London, and we would go often. I would go with my mother, sometimes just me and my mother when I was very little, back to Colombia to see family and to go to Bogota and to Medellin and to Antioquia in general, the rural parts as well, and family holidays. Sometimes we went to Cartagena. So I grew up very much feeling my mother's patriotism and that love of the motherland. And I still feel very much half Colombian in many ways. I feel Colombian, although I grew up here. And I'm looking forward to the game tonight, actually. Tonight, as we record, it will have already long happened when listeners listen to this, but it's Colombia's first game of the Copa America tonight. So I grew up feeling very Colombian, and then working in documentaries as I was until very recently. One of the things I was looking for was documentary subjects, and particularly at one point I was focusing on sporting documentary ideas. And the trend at the moment is for what they call sports adjacent stories. Stories that are about sport, but are about a lot more than sport. Actually, it's not just the story of winning and losing and sporting triumph. You're looking for a story that encapsulates humanity and history and big themes. And I found myself revisiting my connection with Colombia and Colombian football as part of that, especially in an era, sort of post Narcos era. I suddenly remembered really how I had felt really in USA 94. I was, how old was I then? I was about to turn 15. I think I was 14 when World Cup USA 94 happened. So I was a highly impressionable teenage boy, football mad. I had just witnessed, Argentina being humbled 5-0 by a rampant Colombia, heading into the tournament, full of hopes and dreams. Our house in London bedecked with the Colombian flag, and just sort of watched it all fall apart before my eyes. And as a teenage boy, never really came to terms with that. Never really quite understood that. Probably had a tiny bit more insight into what might have happened than some of my peers, but still never really understood it. And so I kind of revisited that sort of trauma, as it were, very small personal trauma for me compared to the bigger events that happened. But I kind of realized there was a bigger story there about Colombian football, the history of Colombian football, the history of Colombia, all tied up with Pablo Escobar, the rise not just of the Medellin cartel, but all the cartel activity and Cali. And so, yeah, I came at this as a sort of half Colombian football fan who had lived through the world, through the 1990 World Cup, through the 1994 World Cup, from a distance, but nonetheless sort of passionately and hopefully. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I came to this project from. It started out as a documentary idea, and it evolved into a project that could be a book.
In 1994, it's such a key year for Colombian football. As you say, the lead-in, you have greats Pele saying "dark horses, Colombia," but then Pele's, with all due respect and not speak ill of the dead, his sort of commentary on football was always a little bit skewed. He said within at that, I remember in the early 2000s, he said within 10 years an African team will win the World Cup. So, there are always commentary, but then we could nitpick on anyone about that. But again, it was a big deal. And Colombians, of course, hearing the football greats saying "dark horses, Colombia." And they came in and there was a joy, wasn't there? There was a joy because of the that lead in, again, the qualification and stuff, but that was really the beginning of, and I use the word joy, but it was the descent from jubilation into where Colombia's football hit rock bottom. I mean, we can go into that in a second, but you as a young football fan, because I didn't particularly, I remember the 94 World Cup, but as a long-suffering England fan, I honestly, I hate to say this to my England listeners, I just like the Scottish fans more. and despite them being knocked out, here, let's put you into my football genesis. I'm a Watford fan, so the highs are very infrequent, and when they are, they're euphoric, but the lows are normal. So I would be the ideal for the Scotland fan, and then I've got the surname, but I don't think you can shift across. But so I'm an England fan, so I didn't really pay attention to the 1994. I watched some games here and there because England weren't there, but I remember, and of course the inserted memory of having lived here now for 18, 20, whatever, how many years, it is a collective memory. And yeah, the joy went out of Colombian football, and it took until 2 World Cups ago for that joy to come back, largely lifted by James Rodriguez, who I will never forgive for changing his name in Cucuta, which was James, to James, because my oldest son's name is James, and the poor kid, being Anglo-Colombian, people say James. So it's a long time of us doing that. But anyway, I digress. It is a personal book. It's very clear. It is a true crime book mixed with that Colombian history and the Escobarian history, and that each chapter kind of takes on the two facets. You put the football alongside what's going on with the narco culture. Coming back and forth, you traveled a lot to Colombia as a kid with your mom. You were in Antioquia. Did you see or feel the representation or the influence or aggression of the sort of narco culture in your youth when you were going back and forth?
I think by the time I started to get old enough to have an inkling of that was around the time my mum stopped taking me, basically. So I was born in 79. I went from being a toddler and going out until it must have been the sort of mid to late, but not latest 80s that I probably last went as a child, probably getting up towards 7 or 8 years old. And so I was aware of military police everywhere and machine guns and gated private, residences and compounds that were more secure, and of kind of hearing about things happening out and about. But I was still quite young, and quite soon after that, my mum would still have to go back for family reasons, but we kind of stopped making it a family trip and a family holiday. And so it was kind of around that point. And so by the time, 1990 World Cup felt very joyous, I think, first time in 28 years in my lifetime that Colombia had been at a World Cup. Nobody really expected very much because of that. And so to get a point off the Germans in such dramatic fashion, and to so nearly, get through the first knockout stages. I mean, it was heartbreaking, but it felt like Colombia won a lot of hearts and minds, for want of a better phrase. Attractive football, colorful characters, wonderful fans, like what we would call a nice brand of football. Not sort of cynical, win at all costs, fouling, negative football, but that sort of brand that I only much later discovered was a kind of Pacho Maturana brand of open, creative, free-flowing, expressive football. Put in your enforcers to earn yourself the right for your attacking players, your Valderramas, to do what they do. And so that World Cup was quite joyous. And then the 1994 World Cup, I'd been a little bit removed from Colombia for a few years at that point and hadn't, directly lived through all that trauma of the late 80s, early 90s. And so I think, like many who will probably read the book, I was coming at it from a slightly outsider's viewpoint and hearing Pele, seeing the 5-0 win in Argentina. Like I say, I was filled with optimism. And you saw, the crowds there and such support in America, and the Eagle Man, the Condor, and that was the first time people really went mad for all of that. And I think it was because I was a little bit removed from it, but I think we were probably all a little bit removed from what was happening behind the scenes, that when you look at it in hindsight, suddenly makes more sense of what happened, which is, the beating Argentina in Buenos Aires 5-0 when Argentina had to win was a sort of seismic event in world football, really, and made people stand up and look at Colombia again and go, well, surely Argentina would have been one of the favorites for this World Cup. So if Colombia can humble them in their own capital city, then, you've got to consider that they might have a chance, right? But I think that happened quite early. There was a long time between that and the World Cup, and a lot happened. The death of Pablo being a huge thing, the repercussions of which were felt by the squad in many ways. And then also there was this period between where suddenly Colombia were the football team were the darlings of the national and to some extent international media, and such recognizable looks and characters, that they became so in demand by sponsors and brands and, for adverts. And they played all these friendly games to get, as much money through the gate as possible, that I think people didn't realize. But by the time they got to the World Cup, they played in so many meaningless games. They'd done so many other things. I don't think they had the best preparation for that World Cup, actually. And then the other thing was what happened with the death of Pablo and the kind of power vacuum that created in Colombian sort of criminal circles, that seems to have facilitated that ability to try to influence the squad and events in America. And so, I think when I was in Colombia as a child, I was sort of vaguely aware as I got older of a lot of the things that were going on that were not great, and that were scary and deadly and horrible. But I was obviously shielded a lot from those by my age and naivety, and by my parents not wanting to, overly expose me to that. And I think, for the outsider, that's the case too with Colombia. They either weren't aware that all of that was going on, or now in hindsight, people are aware of Pablo and the cartels and narco-terrorism and what he did, but perhaps sometimes might incorrectly attribute that to things that happened in Colombian history, Colombian politics, Colombian sporting history.
It's an interesting one, especially your let's say that period of distance I mean, it obviously corresponds when you're talking about the late 80s. It corresponds to that shift in the dynamic, the money. I mean, we know that the money was coming in previous to that, Union Magdalena, and the marijuana boom, and then obviously elsewhere, the money being pumped into football. That 5-0 win feels like Colombia kind of peaked, because we always refer to the 5-0 win, and then you go straight. I mean, people don't, go straight to the own goal, and then Andres Escobar and his brutal killing in a car park in Medellin post World Cup, after the ignominious, exit, and kind of believing their own hype, of course, and being led to believe and being exploited to believe their own hype. They were very good, but at the same time, as you say, these meaningless games, cashing in, rightly so, wrongly so, rightly so, probably cashing in on their newfound fame. These are aside from Andres Escobar, largely these are kids from the comunas, but the poor comunas, because all Medellin are comunas. But these are kids who haven't had these opportunities, and of course, whatever. But so we know more now about this history. We have been exposed more through Narcos. Of course, it's something I've covered here, the Narcos Netflix, a few times. We know more that I didn't enjoy at all. Well, I didn't watch Narcos. I watched 3 episodes, but I live here and know the history. It's not meant for me. Griselda, I watched a couple of episodes before turning it off. I wasn't particularly enamored with that either. I watched the sort of Colombian documentary on Andres Escobar, which was decent, actually. I would say it was a better depiction of some things on the ground and some of the complications facing, people from humble, let's say how it is, poor backgrounds. Narcos, for me, not meant for me, but that a friend of mine, and I say this all the time, a friend of mine calls me up from Canada to say, listen, I had no idea about the assassination of Galan, for example. I had no idea about this, and so he's asking me things. So for that to open a debate, to open a conversation with people with no background to this, is a positive. For us in Colombia, we're like, and then Escobar being played by a Brazilian is not, it's also another. But anyway, fair enough. So it's not aimed at a Colombian market. But now that we know more, now that we are more informed about Colombia and, of course, these dark years, I have to ask, obviously you feel there was the need for another book on this Escobar period. To your detractors, what do you say? Because the Colombians will be like, oh, do we have to?
I know. And I did feel, I have to admit, I did feel those moments where I felt a bit torn about, rehashing a Colombian past that I know, as a nation, Colombia has been for many years desperate to distance itself from Pablo Escobar, and rightly so in so many ways. I think my answer to that would be, I don't feel this is necessarily, although it does follow Pablo's life story, it's not a book purely about Pablo Escobar. And I think I felt that the thing that hadn't been done really, barring, a very good ESPN documentary that I'm not sure how many people around the world have seen, and that is 10, 15 years old now, had tried to do, is to contextualize what happened to Colombian football. So I feel like there are football fans out there who might have seen Narcos and might know what happened at USA 94, but have never joined the dots, and the context of all of that, of the sort of rise and fall of Colombian football and the socio-economic, political history that goes into all of that, I felt was something that was only, all of those aspects were sort of touched on in all the different Escobar depictions, all the different biographies and autobiographies, all the different documentaries and dramatizations sort of allude to his interest in football and what was going on in football, but very few of them bring those two things together. And I think they're so inextricably linked that, it kind of does a disservice to Colombian football to look at it outside of the influence of Pablo and the Narcos, because yes, that money, had a huge influence, but so did that kind of culture of fear and violence that, impacted the World Cup campaign. And so I think there's definitely two different attitudes to a book like this. The person who isn't Colombian or doesn't have an encyclopedic knowledge of Colombia's trauma and the Escobar years, and basically everybody else. And so I guess I thought that this was a chance to help everybody else understand the sporting context of all of that.
Okay.
Football is a huge, it's the global game, and it's a huge passion for Colombia and around the globe. And I felt like almost like what happened in '94 was kind of not quite the butt of people's jokes, but the attitude from the outsider was, wow, look at how Colombia like completely capitulated and fell apart. And then people knew that something had happened to Andres Escobar, but I think half the world probably thinks that Pablo was still alive at that point, and he was directly responsible for it, rather than it was the sort of vacuum of his departure that might have caused that. So yeah, I understand that, reopening old wounds and going over territory that some might feel they know very well or has been covered before isn't always to everybody's taste. I would hope that it's done with a new sort of prism on the whole story. And I hope that my sort of patriotism and passion for not just Colombia, but for Colombian football sort of comes through. And I'd like to think that those outsiders reading it, i.e. most people who are not Colombian or historians of Colombia or Colombian football, will read it and care more about Colombia, be more interested in Colombian football, be more interested in Colombia as a place, rather than less so.
Well, I believe strongly that if the conversation is opened up, then intelligent, sympathetic people can see something different to Colombia, rather than walking into the pub in London, chatting to someone, oh, you live in Colombia, and them tapping their nose. It's like, how tiresome. And so you've had that your whole life. You've had that your whole life. I, on my infrequent travels back, have it, and it's so tiring. And I think obviously perpetuated by the tabloid press and actually the mainstream press, but the tabloid press, when England were going to play Colombia, which is the Daily Star or the Sun that did the sort of the lines on the pitch and someone snorting. This comes out of that 94 period. This comes out of that, because the whole and it's a damage that's taking generations to work its way out, and that's the truth. And I feel when I see that sort of thing coming out in the press, and of course it gets covered here, and Colombians have every right to be sensitive to these things and have every right to, obviously be offended. I think so. I am embarrassed. But the England-Colombia game, which was, again, an incredibly cynical game from both sides, as you say, I wore both shirts in the pub. So there you go. And my Colombian friends were very touched by that. It's hard. It's a hard one, all of these things. So, but when we go back to the book, you feel that the market obviously is beyond Colombia. Well, it's an English book. Will it be translated into Spanish, maybe?
I mean, I hope so. My publishers handle all the international rights. I know there are some conversations that have been had. I'm not sure if anywhere it's got to in Spanish translation, but I'd love that to happen, obviously. I think, just going back to what you said about Narcos and Griselda, I think, again, for better or worse, what's interesting is that for me, working in documentaries, one of the hardest things here until a few years ago was how each nation is when it comes to programming. And you'd like to think it isn't, but basically everything has to be English or have an English or British angle or way in or slant. And if it doesn't, it's just sort of deemed to be too foreign. And I think what's really interesting is the way particularly Netflix as the kind of forerunner, front runner, global leader in streaming, what they've been able to do is prove to the wider world that a Colombian story in Spanish with Spanish subtitles can be watched by millions of people around the world, not just Spanish people, can be a hit in the UK, in America. True for Narcos, true for Griselda, that there is a global audience for foreign stories and foreign languages, and a much more a much greater appetite than a purely parochial one. So I think that, you know, that has started to change, and I'd like to think that, you know, this book is somewhere on that spectrum of, you know, people might pick it up because they think it's about Pablo, or it's about crime, or it's about Colombia, but they think that's a bit exotic and exciting. But actually, you know, by stealth, hopefully they might, you know, learn a deeper understanding of Colombia's history, Colombia's politics, of why certain things happened. And they might just come out of it with just a sort of richer understanding and appreciation for the country and for what happened, really.
And so we think, as you say, people who are, curious about football, curious about international events, true crime, aficionados, people who want to know more about South America. There's quite a big net to cast. I hope your book doesn't end up in like a travel section, because they're kind of hidden away. You want it to get more, yeah. I would say, more into either sports, but it needs to cross. It needs not in the sports section. It needs to be more in a sort of like, I don't know, socio-political, cultural type side of things. Let's get into some of the points that you address in the book, because I think a lot of people forget, unless they watch Narcos, the influence of Pablo Escobar, him getting into Congress. I mean, it's you know, we have rats in Congress now in Colombia. We've had rats in Congress in the UK for Congress, in Parliament for a long time. There are rats in the US Congress, corrupt people. But the known international, I would say the most infamous international godfather of narco trafficking got into Congress, obviously on the back of having sort of paid his way through, different barrios and so on, and getting elected in. What kind of significance for Colombia do you put this into? Because it's addressed in the book, and I think there's a before and after, there's of him, Escobar before getting into Congress, and Escobar getting into Congress and afterwards. How do you feel on this?
Yeah, I totally agree. That's pretty much what I was going to say, actually, that his political career is really interesting, and I think, again, a huge divide, and apologies to those listeners for whom all of this is old news, but I think there's a huge divide, and it's very easy for anybody who does have an interest in Colombia, Colombian politics, Colombian history, and Pablo, probably to forget, I think, how little the wider world does really know about it all, and sort of take it as read. And I think it's important to lay out all of that, which is why I wanted to follow the whole story, really, because I think it is one that a lot of people today just don't know, didn't know about. He was elected as a suplente, and I think that on multiple levels was hugely significant for him, and as a result for the story of Colombia, basically. I think in the first instance, it probably, and this is me not as a political commentator or journalist, but just as an author of this one book, but I feel like it perhaps reaffirmed his belief that he was a man of the people. It helped him build this idea that he was the Paisa Robin Hood, that he had showered benevolences upon the masses of Medellin, and as a result he would become beloved of both Medellin and of Colombia, and gave him some fame and some recognition, and so I think it made him feel confident and happy and good, which could be a dangerous thing. It put him within the machinery of power, which I think he thought would be important. That he would have the power and the position then to influence and change and bully and cajole and bribe and whatever, but from the inside. And a lot of it comes back to extradition. And so, one, he was now immune from prosecution, which meant equally immune from extradition. And at that very moment, extradition was part of the constitution. It then was taken off. It kind of went to and fro quite a bit during the 80s. But it gave him protection. I think it was one of his greatest fears was, as he said, better a grave in Colombia. He would rather die gunned down in his homeland, as indeed he was, than get on a plane and rot in jail in the United States. And so he felt like maybe he'd inserted himself into the upper echelons of power and influence, that justified what he'd done so far, and that he was on the right path. I think, reading and listening to what I did, I think there's a sort of inference, even not an inference, even a kind of stated fact, that he thought he could maybe become president of Colombia one day. And you have to start somewhere, right? So you start in Envigado and the town council, and then you're a suplente, and then time passes, and eventually you bribe enough people and you charm enough people, and so I think all of that was part of his master plan to be safe, to be all powerful, to be above everything, above the law, above politics. And so it was all vital. And then I think what you also alluded to was the end of that and what came after. And I think that was, if anything, more pivotal than the start of that, because I think that's the moment when one half of his dreams were crushed, basically, very publicly, very embarrassingly, being called out and having to leave his political aspirations behind very, very quickly, kind of with his, as best he tried not to be with his tail between his legs. I can imagine he was chastened and embarrassed by all of that, and angry, very angry, I'm sure. And so I feel like it was the destruction of that dream of politics being his path to ultimate power and the ability to be above the law and retribution and extradition and anything else. And when that was taken away, one, I think it, ultimately led to much more violence from his anger and his, desire to find a different way to become above the law. But I suspect that it sort of coincided with his pivot to football at that point. He'd always enjoyed football and loved playing football. But I think when the political door closed, the door that he kicked open was the door to football. And I think, part of my rationale for the book was an understanding or a belief that maybe he saw that the way to win even more hearts and minds, to win so much love and support that he could again be untouchable and above the law, was by bringing glory to Colombia through the national game, through the beautiful game. And that sort of sports washing strategy that he employed primarily through Atlético Nacional, but also through Deportivo Independiente Medellín and through Millonarios, through his partnerships with his cartel partners. I feel like he either embarked on that in earnest or accelerated that, or that became more important to him because of the failing of his political aspirations. Would he have put so much behind the football if he was busy still on the track to political power and maybe even somehow becoming president? I'm not so sure.
That's a really interesting point that I never thought about. I mean, I don't doubt that in his mind he thought he could get to the very top. I don't doubt that at all. But the whole issue of him, did he throw everything into football because of the failure, I find very interesting. Of course, we must say, I mean, he's not the only one who invested into football groups. There are others, and Pablo's the one because of his flamboyance is the one who got the name, and of course and so on. But I mean, we could talk about any number of the big cartels in Colombia, really. For me, coming from a political sort of background, my reading as well of the before and the after is, there's money coming from all sorts of illicit sources in Colombia into the political sphere, way back to the current date, and will be for the foreseeable future, because there's so much money involved. But my reading is also the regionalism. This is a guy from, as I would say, working class. Let's just say working class Medellin, a known gangster, a known narco trafficker, gets into Congress, which is breaking a glass ceiling for someone from the provinces, as the Bogotano elite would see it. And that's when they sat up and went, we can't have this, we can't have this. And how far will he go? And that for me is a political reading. It's the first time that they may have talked about it behind closed doors, but now it was public. The guy who turned up without a tie, it's like, it just showing his lack of education, just showing these things. Again, mentioned in the book, but that's my political reading. But I never thought about a result from his political failure being, right, okay, football. And of course it was a way of influencing. I mean, football is everything here. And I think that's a very important point that you bring up there in that the football. There's another, as we jump around a bit and we're kind of winding down as well, the other, prior to 94 and 90, that other humiliation, of course, was Colombia not hosting the 1986 World Cup and it going to Mexico. And of course, that's not something people know. That's not something that people know. You sort of look at it and go, why did Mexico get it twice from 1970 and then 16 years later? Well, it's a regional thing and so on and so forth. You put it down, it's in your book that it's down to sort of a lack of infrastructure. But I mean, I feel that the level of violence was the underlying reason there. It's like, we can't have international delegations when all of this is going on in the country. I mean, did you feel this as well?
I think it's a bit of both, and I think they're sort of both a mixture of cause and effect of the two things. They're inextricably linked, and I think that's again what I tried to paint that picture with the book, which is that in this period you could not separate those things. The violence and the criminality and the rise of the cartels and cocaine and any sporting endeavor whatsoever really, was just bound to be colored by it. So I mean, Colombia was awarded the 86 World Cup hosting rights in, I think, 1974, and that's really before the rise of Pablo and the cartels. And so, didn't seem like a particularly controversial thing, I'm sure, back then. It was at the end of 1982, I think, that I believe Colombia blinked first and actually sort of preemptively handed back the rights, but they knew that FIFA were planning on sending a delegation to the country, and it was kind of a fait accompli that they were going to rule that Colombia wasn't in a good place to host. And so I think they just thought, we'll preempt them and we'll hand it back ourselves. And yes, I think by that point, the end of 1982, Colombia was definitely in a worse place than it was in 1974. It wasn't yet in the worst place it was going to be in. It's pre the assassination of Lara. Pablo is, I think, in that very small window of actually being an active, or I'm not particularly active, but a politician in that moment, sort of semi-legitimized. So I don't think it was the peak of Colombian violence and terror. But I'm sure, yes, security concerns. I mean, I would sort of argue that they kind of come into the infrastructural concerns.
Yeah.
It's the ability to smoothly and safely host an international competition. And I think security would have been a huge factor in that. Security of officials, security of teams, security of fans. But I think equally, the Colombian state hadn't been able to prioritize doing all the things that needed to be done in order to get the stadia built and up to scratch and build all the rest of the infrastructure, because their time, resources, money, attention were taken by other things, partly political issues, but also national security issues, and dealing with the rise of the cartels of Pablo and of criminality. So I think in all kinds of ways, I can imagine Colombia was not in a good place to host that World Cup. They still had 4 years before it was due to start. But I don't think the trajectory looked like it was going to get better. And of course, as we know, it ended up getting a lot worse.
Yeah.
So I think they're sort of interrelated, and in the end, the FIFA delegation, I don't think went, and so we don't quite know what their findings might have been. But if the Colombians were already deciding to throw in the towel, you can imagine it wasn't looking too good. But yes, you're right. It's a slightly less well known part of Colombian history. And it could have, things could have been so different. There are so many moments in Colombian history and in the book, I hope, where you think, gosh, if that hadn't happened, the big one would be if Pablo somehow had never happened. But equally, if he'd not got elected, or he'd not got kicked out of his political career, or all these moments where for large periods of time, sort of almost the worst thing that could happen did happen, and just sent things off down another path.
That feels like a lot of things in Colombia. Well, a lot of things all around the world. Again, this is it. We'll have to close this down, otherwise we can talk for hours. I don't feel personally that Colombian clubs are protected from the money influence and money laundering issues. I think they're still vulnerable from this, and we see this as well. Let's say the soft politics, the soft diplomacy of, oh yeah, here we go, Saudi Arabia, or the Abramovich investment in Chelsea, and all of it. There's a similar vein, different obviously in the way it's done and so on, but there's a similar vein. I know, and I was reading yesterday about 11 or 15 Colombian referees are under investigation for throwing matches and so on. So the money's here, unfortunately. The money's everywhere. That can be your next book, but I understand that you are working on a book at the moment.
Yes, yeah. So I'm working on another book. It's also in the true crime and history space, which is I've always loved history, and I studied history at A-level, and I've always gravitated towards meaty historical subjects in a lot of the documentaries I've developed, and then I think anything, crime gives you great narrative and jeopardy and drama, as does sport, and so it's in a similar vein. It's not sporting, and it's not about football, but it hasn't been announced yet, so I can't tell listeners too much more, unfortunately. But yeah, I think anything where the stakes really are life and death in these stories, and like I say, they transcend whatever genre they're in, I think, because they speak to the grander themes of our lived humanity, basically, of life and death, and wanting to be loved, or wanting to be feared, or wanting to be powerful or successful, or wanting to have joy, wanting to celebrate. So yeah, the new book is sort of similar but not the same.
Is it about Colombia, yes or no?
It is not about Colombia, no.
There we go.
Sorry, listeners.
Thank you. Thank you for your time, David. It's been an absolute pleasure, and you've really gone into depth in this conversation about the issues in Colombia. I think we can use it as, a parallel set of information to also, really describe the political situation, even up to today, and obviously it will be beyond today in Colombia. David Arrowsmith, author of Narcoball, Love, Death, and Football in Escobar's Colombia, out now, available in, I suppose, good bookshops and online. Have a read if you are interested. David, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure. I hope everybody's enjoyed listening along.
Thank you again. This has been episode 525 of the Colombia Calling podcast. We'll go over to some messages now from our sponsors. And remember, please check us out on patreon.com/Colombia Calling, and never miss an episode. Just hit subscribe or follow on wherever you prefer to download your podcast. Thank you to everyone, and goodbye.